Hello and welcome to CG Visuals, and in part 2 of this tutorial we're going to take our pre-rendered destroyer and we're going to learn how to composite smoke and fire assets. Now everything you see here was generated 100% in After Effects. You won't need any third-party tools or plugins to follow along with this tutorial. Every asset that we're going to be working with is going to be included completely free, and there'll be a download link in the description to this video. So even if you don't stick around for the tutorial, I'm sure you'll get some fun out of these assets. But if you do stick around, we're going to add these trace arounds, we're going to look at some advanced techniques for compositing these assets, and at the very end we add this cloud of smoke pellets and flares which the ship deploys. I believe it's a system called chaff, so deploy chaff! And without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to pick off exactly where we left off last time, where we had this pre-rendered destroyer, which we now have as a MOV file. We also added a reflection shadow, and I actually found that if we drag this shadow layer above the destroyer, it creates a slightly more pleasing result. So the first thing we'll do is add some smoke. Go to the first frame. As you can see, this smoke fades in. Some of these assets are already available for free on the YouTube channel, but I'll include all the relevant links just to make things more easy to follow along. So we might try and make the suggestion that the ship has been damaged somehow. Now, if we want to do something like this with smoke behind the ship, it would make sense that some of the smoke is starting to bleed over the edges here. So we'll copy this layer, and what we can do, if we put that black smoke layer on top of the destroyer, then we copy the destroyer, or duplicate, and pressing Ctrl D, we'll move that over the smoke. And then with this destroyer layer, we'll use this as essentially, we'll use the alpha channel of this layer as a matte. And that way we can play around with the matte and do things like this to it. We'll go to the track matte for the black smoke and we'll tell it to use the alpha channel of the destroyer. And I think we'll have to choose the inverted one. So now, as we start adjusting this simple choker, we can have the smoke choke over the ship. And of course, if we add a blur effect, we can just make it look like some of the smoke is bleeding over a little bit. And if we only want this smoke to be affecting near the actual ship itself, we can just do a quick mask operation, add some feathering to it. We could also bring the opacity down a little bit, and we could bring the opacity down of this smoke element a little bit, or better still, we could create a ramp effect by creating a subtraction mask and blurring it. Let's add some more variation to the smoke. We have this black smoke small element, so let's drag this underneath all our layers. Press R to bring up the rotation. You can also press A to bring up the anchor point and put the anchor point to where the emission point of the smoke should logically be. And that way we can just... One slightly more efficient way to do this would be to pre-compose all of the smoke into one layer and then use the same technique to have the smoke bleed over like we did before. But in this case, it might not be necessary. Would be nice to try and have some more smoke on top of the ship. Of course, when we start putting assets on top of assets, in this case, we might be able to suggest that this asset is smoke that's just coming around the side of the ship there. So we'll just hide that emission point by creating a subtraction mask. Press F to bring up the feathering. Choose subtraction. We are going to need to make sure that all of these assets are parented to the destroyer so that they have the same positional animation as our destroyer. So we can simply just select all the elements that we've placed down so far and we'll just parent them to the destroyer asset. So now all of our assets will have the same positional information as the ship. So we've got some smoke there. So that's looking okay. Now what I want to do is try and pre-compose all of this smoke so that we can have a little bit more control over it. Also that it just doesn't clog up the whole scene. So I think if we make sure that all of our smoke is being parented to this destroyer asset here. And in fact, I think we're actually going to have to, well, let's first of all, we'll duplicate our destroyer layer here. And that way we can pre-compose these smoke assets here, which need to be parented to one of those destroyer layers. And that way we can go to layer, pre-compose, move the assets into a new comp. So now we have those, of course, this destroyer asset here is just there for the parenting options. So that will give us that smoke. We've got our destroyer layer here. And we also have these smoke assets here which went on top of the destroyer. So we can simply select those, shift left clicking them all, pre-compose. And just for simplicity's sake, we'll just give them a very simple name. If we have lots of compositions, lots of pre-comps, and they're all called pre-comp, it'll get a little bit confusing. So now we've got our smoke layers here, and we can quite easily control them, making sure they're parented correctly. Let's just test this very quickly then, see what it looks like. I am caching it in half res, so it's going to look a bit blurry for the time being. That smoke's moving quite quickly. So what we might do, and that is this layer here. No, it's this layer. Okay, well we'll go to our black smoke small, and I think we'll select both of them. We'll just go to time stretch, and we'll increase the time, which will also decrease the number of frames, so they could end up looking a little bit choppy or low frame rate, but we might be able to get away with that simply by going to frame blending, and we'll choose something like pixel motion, and that will attempt to fill in the missing frames. There are more sophisticated plugins for After Effects like Twixtor, which can allow you to get some pretty amazing results, but that is a third-party tool, and not everyone is going to have access to that. So we'll go for this option. So let's see if that smoke looks slightly slower. You can see it is looking a little bit choppy. So what I might do instead is just bring down the opacity so it's not so obvious. Let's also solo this layer. We'll just have a little look at it, see how bad the choppiness really is. I wonder if the frame, if we choose a frame mix, if that will give us a better result. I think we're going to have to go for something a little bit more conservative with the time stretch. We'll keep it on pixel motion, and I suppose, well, let's see what that looks like. It's less obvious, so we'll go for 125. Like I said, if you have Twixtor, you could slow it down by almost twice as much, and Twixtor will fill in the missing frames for you, and you'll get some pretty incredible results. Let's make sure we bring the opacity back down there. I think I'll also just move this smoke layer down a little bit as well. Let's do the same to this black smoke small as well. It's quite a fast moving element. That's the whole thing with assets. You can change them, you can time rewarp them. So that should be the smoke done. So now let's move on to something a bit more interesting. We did have some other smoke assets here. So I'm not necessarily going to use all of them in this example, but I'll include them nevertheless in case you want to do something that differs from this tutorial perhaps. So let's go to our fire assets. These again are also free assets on our YouTube channel, but let's start popping down some fire. These ones don't actually come with an alpha channel. They were developed quite a while ago. So I'm just changing the blending mode to screen. I'm going to press A and change the anchor point of these assets so that when we do change the scale, they're not going to move away from where we intend them to be. So we can press scale here. I'm also going to go to time, stretch, and I'm going to increase the length of this asset so that it lasts as long as our comp here. I've decided that our timeline is going to go to 7 seconds because that's all I rendered of the destroyer. I only rendered 7 seconds of it. Could have rendered more, but I think 7 seconds will be fine just to show what we're trying to do. Excuse me a second. Okay, so I want to make it seem like this ship is on fire. I want it to seem like there's fire spread all over the decks. We will of course have these assets behind the destroyer, but this is a little bit easier just to line them all up. You could randomize them a little bit by flipping them. Let's have a little bit of fire up there as well. I don't know, maybe the ship was hit by a napalm bomb or something. The explosion decided that it wanted to spread the fire over the ship in a aesthetically pleasing way so that at least people looking at the destruction could appreciate how nice it looked. So we'll have some fire just scattered around the place. Some variation in the size. Could probably even do some smaller stuff up here. Probably best to be a little bit more conservative actually. If we start duplicating the asset too much, it might start to look a little bit ridiculous. I'll move this one over here. So now I'm going to pre-compose. Well, actually first let's also do this intense fire asset, which we can help to add a little bit more variety to the shapes that we're seeing. I'll have them, I only want to see the top of this asset sort of. We'll see some of those flames coming over the side of the deck. It will look quite nice. Do something like that. So now we'll pre-compose all of these fire assets by going layer pre-compose. Of course we'll set them to screen again. And now we'll duplicate our destroyer asset once again and we'll simply use this as an alpha matte, an alpha channel. Obviously we don't want those bits to be visible, so we'll just get rid of them with a mask. Now the fun part is if we pre-compose these layers again, and then we set them to screen once again, now they already have they've already been masked, which means any effects we apply on top of these will bleed over the mask that we've created. So we can have some fun with this now. We can go to blurs and we can choose a compound blur. If we click invert blur, this is a slightly more sophisticated way of doing a blur than just like a Gaussian blur. We can create some more subtle sort of bleeding effects here. Then we could duplicate this and we could uncheck the invert blur and we'll get some interesting results. I don't really know if that's what we want to go for necessarily, but... And of course we can add a glow. If we go to effect, stylize glow, and let's just set this to screen, and we can just add a little bit more of an ominous feel just by adding that. I think the fire looks way too bright and yellow. I kind of imagine it being more of a reddish look, so if we go effects, color correction and tritone, let's say for the mid-tones we want to have a more reddish sort of hue. Something like that should work. For the highlights, we'll go for a more orangey look maybe. We can always control the overall blending of this effect, so we have our original and what we've done. So maybe somewhere in between will look nice. We could then add a color correct curves adjustment on top of that, maybe just to bring it down a little bit. Of course we are getting rid of the nice glows that we created, so perhaps we don't want to do that. Could quickly experiment with the different blending modes. It's always worth just having a little look. You might accidentally stumble across something that looks nice. Let's re-enable this compound blur and see what kind of effect it gives us. We'll move it after the glow and see what that will give us. It's an interesting effect. I don't really know what it's doing. I wonder if we just reapply the effect again, will it change anything? I really am curious to see what that's going to look like. Let's keep it on something conservative like 10 perhaps. Let's preview that in half res. Well no, actually we're going to have to do that in full res. It almost creates the appearance of some sort of chemical interference and heat distortion, so quite an interesting effect. Could also have the fire be additive if you wanted it to be that bright. I mean, that does look quite nice actually. We could even increase that glow. Oh, that's interesting. The glow seems to interfere with this compound blur here. That is interesting. Let's duplicate the blur, have another one after the compound blur. With this one we'll just use it to create some very nice looking fire. Do we like what's going on over here? Perhaps the original compound blur here, we could bring that down a bit. So that's quite interesting. As you can see, by changing some of these effects we can get some drastically different results. What we originally had See what it looks like with screen again. I think the additive is giving the fire quite an interesting look. We could even duplicate this layer. We could disable some of these effects. Put it to screen mode, and we could just bring the opacity down a little bit. Maybe give it a gamma curve in the curves adjustment here. Just bringing back some of what we had before. So that way the fire doesn't end up looking too soft. Rather than lowering the opacity, we could also go to the alpha value of the curves adjustment here and bring that down. I think we'll just add a normal Gaussian blur to this fire, with maybe like 0.1 or 2. Keep the opacity very low. Let's have a quick look at how that looks. Thing about seeing fire from this distance, with all that smoke around it, you're not going to get a perfectly... Well, I think the adjustments we've made are making the fire look more convincing. Of course, we could even play around with putting some of the smoke on top of the fire. Might have been a bad idea to give both these smoke layers the exact same name, come to think of it. Let's call this one Smoke 2. And let's check that this is definitely the right layer. Okay, yes, so this is the smoke that goes over the ship. That's the smoke that goes behind the ship. And we've duplicated smoke layer 2 here. But what if we duplicated this layer and tried putting that on top? Perhaps that's not going to yield the best results, as it's supposed to be underneath the ship. There's nothing wrong with having a little bit of experimentation. I mean, who knows, maybe moving something somewhere you didn't intend might result in something that looks nice. You don't know until you try. I mean, I didn't intend for it to look like this, so we'll dial up the opacity of this fire just a little bit. I think I'm going to keep that. It looks quite interesting. Of course, we want to replicate what's going on in the shadow there, in the reflection. We want to also include the assets that we've got. So I think we could just flip the smoke layer upside down. Set that to soft light. Make sure we give it a really good Gaussian blur as well. I was starting to think that perhaps this shadow looked too sharp, so I'll increase the blur in the shadow as well. It would also be really nice to get those fire assets being reflected in the water as well. Have to be a little bit careful how we do this though. As we still need to have some sort of screen blending mode. What would probably work, actually, if we added some distortion, if we've got fire being reflected in the water, if we add some sort of distortion, maybe a turbulent displace, make sure the size is very small, maybe something like 5. We'll bring the complexity of that effect up. We can go to the size, and unfortunately we have to scale it up uniformly. Would it be nice to be able to sort of stretch it out somehow? How is that going to look? wonder if there's a better way to do this. Let's have a look at our distortion options again. We could create a fractal noise effect that looks like the water and then use that as some sort of displacement map. But that might be a little bit too time consuming. This is supposed to be fun. Perhaps we could use the roughen edges effect again. That's probably going to give us something close to what we want. We can dial down. We could even perhaps just disable this turbulent displace. I mean, it is contributing to the effect slightly, so we'll keep it. I'm also going to move this, and I'll call it fire reflection as well. I'll move that underneath the ship. We'll go to our roughen edges effect and see what we can achieve. If we increase the border here, that might do something. Let's solo this layer actually and just see what's going on. It might be better to disable some of these effects that we had before. Okay, let's bring the scale down on our... And of course, with this plugin, I think we can actually stretch the effect a little bit as well. We've got complexity, keep that at 2. We'll have the edge sharpness at maximum, well, about 3.4 or something. Got fractal influence. Re-enable some of those effects. Okay, that one doesn't really seem to help. Let's try increasing this. Might create an interesting effect. I don't know if this is really helping. I think at this point, if we just add a Gaussian blur on top of everything that we've done, maybe even go to... Well, let's have a look at that, see what it looks like. We've made quite a few changes. I'm going to try adding... I think the problem is that this layer doesn't actually have an alpha channel. Well, we can achieve an alpha channel very easily just by going to Effect, Channel, Set Matte, as most of the predominant colour here is red. If we choose the red channel, we'll get the best results. And then we'll go to Effect, Channel, Remove Colour Matting. And let's try putting this at the beginning of all these effects. I think now our turbulent displace is going to have a much different effect than before. Disable the Gaussian blur. Let's enable the roughen edges. Okay, so now that this layer has an alpha channel, the border has a very different, well, the settings that we've got just have a very different effect. So I'm just going to reset everything. And bring the scale down, we'll bring fractal influence down, bring the complexity up, obviously want that border setting to be a lot less intense. Got a slider here for the scale which might help. Okay, let's have a quick look at what that's doing. It's creating an interesting effect. Let's re-enable these and see what they do. Okay, wow, so having that glow definitely changes it a lot. The first glow that we had, we could probably dial that down a bit. This compound blur here seems to be changing things a lot. Let's re-enable our Gaussian blur here. Let's try doing one more turbulent displace. Yes, we'll do a turbulent displacement, see what that does. You might want to animate this offset turbulence. Since the fire is moving so much, might not be necessary. Okay, let's decrease the size even more. We'll add some animation to this turbulence here. I've just alt left click on the stopwatch next to evolution and just type in time star 200. Give us a continuous movement in the reflection there. At this point I'm going to have a little play around with the blending modes and see what we can achieve. I think the last thing we'll do then is do a directional blur. Choose 90. I think I'll just try bringing the opacity down. If it's difficult to get an effect to work, sometimes just bringing the opacity down is a good idea. I think if we bring the opacity down but change the blending mode to additive, it starts to look a little bit more convincing. I'm just wondering if we can add a glow. Personally, I don't think that glow's really... it kind of adds something. I'm going to move this Gaussian blur that we made before, just have it after the directional blur. Just blur the hell out of it at this point. Gonna let this cache in for a second. Another thing we need to be aware of is the fire assets that we made need to be parented to the ship. As you can see, they're just sort of drifting off, so before we forget about that, I'm just going to go into our... let's see. Yeah, for some reason we never parented our fire assets. Just a simple, easy thing to do, but, well, that fixed it. We just had to go into the fire pre-comp and make sure that the assets were parented to the destroyer, so they don't end up floating off. Okay, so that should do it for the fire. Let's have one last look at this to make sure we're happy. Yeah, the reflection of the smoke looks okay, and then of course we've got this smoke which is behind the ship. I think what I might do is go to layer styles. We'll just add an inner glow to this smoke. Because it has an alpha channel, we'll be able to have some of the colour from the sky bleed over into the smoke. I think the default setting looks quite nice, but let's see what we've got. We've got the range there. Got the size. I'm looking for settings that make a noticeable difference to how it looks. Sometimes what I'll do is if I can't figure out what a setting does, I'll just drag it to one extreme to the other. Try and figure out whether it's actually having any sort of effect. It's fun, it's behaving more like just a colour overlay rather than an inner glow, which is fine though, it's giving us the effect that we want. I'll just increase the opacity of this fire layer here just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to give this some time to actually properly cache in so we can have a look at it. one quick thing is we'll just bring down the opacity of this shadow layer here. Right, let's cache it in, see what it looks like. Okay, so it seems to be looking quite nice. It could be questionable as to whether some of that fire is a little bit too predominant in some areas. I think rather than changing the values of the fire, I'm just going to move some of the assets that we made down just a little bit. Specifically the assets towards the back of the ship. I'm just going to move them down a little bit so that less of them will be visible. Just a little bit more subtle. And that element here at the front of the ship, that might look better if more of it was in fact visible. Should be around here. Should be able to see it. Let's bring it up even more. Okay, awesome. So that's going to do it for the fire and smoke. I mean, we could keep tweaking. I am tempted to keep tweaking it to no end. But at some point, we have to just decide what works. I think I'm going to maybe bring down the intensity of some of these glows a little bit. Sometimes when I disable this layer, I almost wonder if maybe it's just working better without it. Maybe it'd be better to have 100% or nothing. Well, maybe what I really want to happen is I think just at the back of the ship here. I don't think it's really working at the front of the ship, so I'm just going to control it with a mask here. Really simple. Okay, the next thing we're going to do, which is a little bit more exciting, is we're going to add some tracer assets to the ship to try and make it seem like the ship is trying to shoot down a missile. So we've got these tracer rounds, which I've picked out that work quite well for this shot, and I'm going to include them in 4K as well in the download link because the file size isn't actually that big. Because they're just tracers, so even if I include the file as 4K, it won't actually have a very large file size, which is good. So I know there's some sort of gun thing back here. Let's make sure we're parenting that to the destroyer. And we'll set the blending mode to something like additive so we can see it a little bit better. I think if we just solo these layers, just so we can tell what we're working on. So this has a sort of pre-built-in muzzle flash. I'm going to adjust that anchor point a little bit. Since it's 4K, we can size it down quite a bit as well. I can think of a little trick we can do to try and make that muzzle flash a little bit smaller. We could go to distort, and I think if we go to something like bulge, perhaps, should be that effect. As you can see what it does, but we should be able to get the opposite effect as well. We should actually be able to have it sort of do an opposite of a bulge, where it kind of sucks the asset in a little bit, and that will essentially give the appearance of it being smaller. increase the radius of the effect a little bit. There we go, so now our muzzle flash just looks a little bit smaller. We also have another asset that we're going to put on top of this, which is this rapid heavy fire gunpowder smoke asset. Parent it to the destroyer. This time the anchor point should be in the right place. Essentially it's just this really cool smoke that just blasts out, so bring the scale down quite a bit, something like 10 maybe. And this is just going to make the effect look a little bit more visceral with some smoke coming out. Probably wouldn't even, you'd have a hard time seeing the muzzle flash in broad daylight anyway. So we've got that asset there, and I think we could even, so it goes off straight away. Let's have a slight delay so we can appreciate the fire before anything happens. So it fires off a volley. We could even duplicate that as well, move it over here, and then we could quite simply rotate it as well. In fact, if we don't want the effect to look too similar, we could even uncheck the uniform scale, and we'll just put a minus on the values here. We'll re-enable uniform scaling, and that will essentially have it shooting off in the opposite direction. So now we can just get the rotation, move it back over there. See what that looks like. Give it a quick preview. So now we're making it look like our destroyer's trying really hard to try and shoot down some incoming projectile. I think I'm going to flip the scale around the other way as well. Oops, we don't want to do both of them in the same way. We only want to have one of them selected. Select the other one. Yeah, that looks okay. Just move that up a little bit. Trying to suggest there's some sort of gun battery there. So we've got these traces shooting off. You could probably even get away with animating the rotation very slowly. Just a little bit of rotation. Probably try a little bit more. Do the same with the other asset as well. And the trace is moving so quickly that we might not be able to notice the fact that we've actually rotated the whole asset. Okay, cool. Have one last look at it. Basically, I want the last frame to look like the traces sort of crisscrossing a little bit. And then the last thing the ship's going to try and do to protect itself is it's going to deploy all of its smoke canisters. There's a really cool shot in the show, The Last Ship, where when a missile's about to hit the ship, it launches loads of smoke canisters in every single direction. The whole idea is the missile gets tricked by all of that smoke and flares and stuff and so doesn't actually impact the ship itself, but just explodes sort of point blank range from the ship. So we've got some assets. These ones slightly lower resolution, but for what we're trying to do, it should be okay. So let's pop these behind the ship, I think. Since these are just shooting off, they don't really need to be parented to the ship. We do want them to go off about after the tracers stop firing. So I don't know where these sort of systems on the ship actually are. I'm not really an expert, so I'm just going to position them in places that I think look cool. We'll have one go off here that's actually above. Maybe these things here, like maybe we could pretend that those are the things shooting out smoke canisters. I don't know. I'll have 3 of them go off. Let's just move our timeline slider thing here so we're only rendering the bit that we need. Let's have them go off slightly different times, and of course we'll randomize the rotation. I think that one would look cooler like that. Trying to make it look like they're firing off in all directions. Okay, and then when all these little flares go off, what they're going to do is deploy a bunch of smoke. I think we'll have them go off slightly earlier as well. They all get to about here, and then all the smoke comes out. So we've got another asset here that we can use. So essentially it's just this sort of smoke detonation thing. So let's see, we could have... I'm not going to do it for every single one of these. So we could have one there. Tell you what, I'll just move them to all of the areas that I think should have some smoke. Randomizing the rotation as I go. So that way we've got just a respectable amount of smoke going off. Let's see, maybe one over here as well. Then we'll offset them so they go off one frame after each other, so they don't all detonate at exactly the same time. So some of them, for example, this one, which one am I trying to select? This one looks like it could go behind the ship, so drag that down. Also going to just need to see these layers a little bit more. Which other asset? This one, that one should probably go in front of the ship. We'll just duplicate it. Have another one behind the ship as well. I think it will look cool if some of the assets are going behind the ship. I kind of feel like these ones at the end should probably be behind the ship. And the one on the left hand side, I think we'll put that behind the ship as well. And what we can do is pre-compose all the smoke explosions that are over the ship, and we'll pre-compose all the smoke explosions that are under the ship. And we can re-enable all our layers again. And now we can start trying to balance all of these. Let's also pre-compose these smoke trails. I'll just call them trails under. And just pre-compose that one as well. Trails over. Because we do need to control where they're going. We don't want them to look like they're shooting off into the water. It's going to look a bit peculiar. Give it some feathering. Do the same with the trails under here as well. They certainly shouldn't be going into the ocean like that. Going to do the same thing with the smoke as well. Some of the smoke is actually being revealed underneath the ship. Which doesn't look realistic. Give it a tiny bit of feathering. Same thing with the smoke over. Actually, I think that should be okay. We'll go to all of the... Let's see, what blending mode should we use? Lighten, perhaps? I don't think we need to use a blending mode with the smoke in here. Try to decide whether that actually benefits the effect. I think we'll just bring the opacity down a tiny bit, like 90 or something. Might just bring the overall opacity down slightly. So if we put it to lighten, I mean if we put it to screen we're going to get too much overblown pixels, but if we put it to lighten we should get a pretty good effect. I'll do the same thing here as well, put that to lighten. Lower the opacity slightly. Bring the opacity of the overall layer down a little bit. And then of course we can see if we need to play around with these smoke trails at all. I think the smoke trails are okay, but we're going to want to colour correct our smoke obviously. So let's see, we can go to colour correct tritone. Want to select the brightest point in the image. Copy that to the other smoke here. I'm going to copy that colour adjustment to the trails as well. I think if we added our favourite effect, the compound blur, to the smoke, we could get some very interesting results. Let's try inverting the blur and just seeing what the differences are. Okay, so definitely got options for how we want this to look. It looks a little bit too sharp, so maybe if we just give something like 0.5 or 1. I think we're going to have to try and make the smoke look slightly darker on the left hand side. I don't think curves is really going to help. Let's see what layer styles can do for us. We'll try a... I wonder what perhaps a drop shadow might work. I don't know, perhaps we can get the smoke looking darker on one side and lighter on the other. If we use this effect very subtly, it might actually be useful. Let's bring the opacity down. I'm going to put the blending mode back to lighten, I think. Introduce a few shadows. Let's go back to layer styles. I wonder if a bevel would work. Going to go to the angle. Just trying to figure out what the right angle is. Whoa. Maybe we could have used a bevel on our light reflections there. I'm not going to try and do it now. It's too late. Well, it's just... kind of difficult to judge which direction the light's coming from. I think perhaps there will do it. There we go. We could just try and make this smoke look like it's got a little bit of a shadow. We could even bump up the size in that case. And then we'll bring the opacity right back down, adding a little bit of variation into that smoke. We could go to the tritone effect and just bring it down a little bit. And actually, instead of doing that, let's keep working with these layer styles. They seem to be working quite well. Let's go to an inner glow. Go to our inner glow settings and choose a dark part of the sky. Let's choose the darkest part of the sky, I think. We'll set the blending mode to normal. And we've got our range here. Okay, so we can make it look like the sky's bleeding into the smoke a little bit. What have we got? We've got range. What does that do? It brings it in a bit more. Okay, that's interesting. I think we're going to use the effect in just a very subtle way. So that's with it off, and if we introduce it a little bit, let's definitely bring down the highlights of that smoke actually, come to think of it. It's a little bit ridiculous. Just bring it down a little bit. I'm actually going to copy these effects. I'll also, yeah, so we'll copy these effects that we've done into the smoke underneath. We can also copy, I'll copy it to the smoke trails as well. I think the bevel and emboss effect needs to be much more subtle. We'll just put the opacity down to something like 10 or 15. It just needs to be very subtle. Drop shadow. Could probably bring that down a little bit as well. Maybe even the colour. Doesn't need to be black. We'll bring the opacity down to 15. Okay, let's try copying these layer styles into one layer at a time. Disable that smoke. Let's copy the layer styles into the smoke trails. Then we'll disable the smoke trails. Look okay. I might keep the inner glow one here, but just bring the opacity down quite a bit. Got the smoke underneath here. Just going to disable the smoke trails just so we're just looking at the smoke here. That's the smoke that goes behind the ship. Looks rather strange, so I'm just going to bring the highlights down a little bit. Could possibly bring the opacity down of those trails. Press T. Just basically just reducing the intensity of the effects that we've already got now. I might reduce the intensity of this smoke asset here. Not sure which one it is. I'll move it up a little bit. Bring the opacity down. Do the same with this one. Okay, that should work. Haven't actually... I think it would take too long to try and cache this in now since we've got all the effects enabled. So what we'll do is I think I'll just pre-compose everything to one layer, and we'll just add a little bit of color correction to the whole thing. And then we'll render this out. So let's pre-compose. We'll duplicate the layer, choose soft light, tint the layer, reduce the opacity, create a adjustment layer, hold down left click, select the elliptical tool, double tap elliptical tool, create a circle for us automatically, go to subtract, give it a feathering of 400, and then create a curves adjustment. Very simple vignette. Then we'll go to composition settings. We're going to add the cinematic crop, so pre-compose everything. Go to settings, change the height back to 1080. And if we want to reposition where the camera is, we can just do something like that. Okay, awesome. So now I'm going to render this out and then we'll have a look at it. Okay, so I've just finished rendering this. I rendered it as a QuickTime, and for the format I chose a photo PNG, which gives you a pretty good compromise between quality and file size. And so now, if we bring this pre-rendered clip into our composition, and we'll play it back and see what it looks like. Of course, we've got the fire and the smoke, all the trace rounds go off, and then the ship deploys some smoke canisters as a sort of last resort. Okay, so we're going to wrap things up there. If you have any questions about this tutorial, be sure to let me know in the comments section. And stay tuned for more content and future releases of more tutorials and assets. And until next time, thanks for watching.